A New York judge has temporarily blocked a policy put in place by a city that would have reduced the rents that landlords could charge by 15%. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News. Alright, so I have an update today, and it's an update to a video I just did a few days ago about this insane story coming out of New York State about a city that implemented a rent control policy, one of the first places to do so outside of New York City. And rather than saying, hey, landlords can only raise their rents by a certain percentage, they came and said landlords have to lower their rents by 15%. They said landlords are charging too much, so we're going to force them to cut their rents. Not only that, but they said it's retroactive all the way back to August. So any rent increases that landlords put in place from August going forward were going to be affected by this. This is insane, okay? They said there were 1,200 units within the city that would have fallen under this. And I know that this isn't the biggest city, but you know what? This sort of thing, it's a slippery slope, okay? So how long before, if like New York City sees something like this happen and then they're like, hey, we're going to implement something similar where we're actually going to force landlords to cut their rents. Okay. It's insane, okay? This sort of thing should not be allowed to pass. And fortunately, there was a judge and they put a temporary stop to it. I don't know how long this temporary stop is going to last, but you know, it's at least for now stopped. So yeah, this is insane. So before I get into the article, go ahead, hit the like and subscribe button. Maybe leave a comment down below. Let me know what you think, okay? Do you believe that this sort of law is going to be allowed to pass, or do you think it will get thrown out by this judge? And, you know, I'm just curious if you think that you would see something similar to this in New York City or in other places in New York. Now, I know this town, Kingston, I mean, it looks like a really nice place. You know, it has a, beautiful looking urban area. You know, I think they call it their uptown, right? Now, I was looking at pictures of it before I read the other article, and, you know, it just looked like a really nice place. But, you know, when they put this sort of policy in place and they punish landlords like this, you know, it takes away people's ability to make money and run their businesses. And that's just not right, okay? So let's get into the article. This article is coming from timesunion.com, and it says, Judge temporarily blocks Kingston rent reduction measure. A Hudson Valley activist group condemned the decision in strongest possible terms. Yeah, I'm not surprised that activist groups don't like this, okay? Now, if it was up to the tenants, they would just come out and say, listen, we just want to be able to stay for free. And you should have to maintain the building and keep it updated and everything. And there's no chance for us ever being evicted. So we get free rent, we get to stay forever, and it should be all paid by you. That's what the tenants would say if they really were being honest, right? But, you know, they're going to condemn the measure. And I'm like, hey, you don't understand that this might not even be legal. But anyway, let's get into this article and see what it says. An Ulster County Supreme Court judge on Friday temporarily blocked the Kingston Rent Guideline Board's attempt to significantly lower rents for certain properties covered by the Emergency Tenant Protection Act. The decision by Judge David M. Gandon came about a week after the board voted 6-3 to enact a 15% rent reduction for the 64 buildings, which include about 1,200 rental units, under its jurisdiction in Kingston. It was the first time in the state's history that a Rent Guidelines Board approved a rent reduction. Okay, so this thing, it wasn't even close, the vote, right? It was a 6-3 vote, which means that, 66% of all the people voting wanted this to pass. What does that tell you? It tells you that, hey, this, the Rent Guidelines Board, it's a very biased board, biased towards the tenant and against the landlord. Because anyone with common sense, even people who aren't renters and aren't landlords, would say, hey, don't landlords have expenses? Hasn't there been inflation? Do you really think it's a good idea to say no rent increase at all and then actually a rent reduction? I mean, anyone with common sense would say, hey, this isn't smart. This is economically an idiotic move. And, but they're not thinking logically. They're thinking emotionally. They're thinking in terms of what benefits them personally the most. And that's what the problem is, okay? You cannot have people up here who say, hey, we're in charge of, setting the prices, but it personally benefits us, because when you do that, right, they're going to only do things that benefit them personally. Last month, a newly formed group of landlords, the Hudson Valley Property Owners Association, sued the city to prevent it from entering into the ETPA, claiming Kingston improperly conducted a housing vacancy study that enabled it to declare a housing emergency, a necessary precondition to adopting rent stabilization. The Rent Guidelines Board vote to reduce rents followed months of organizing by tenants and activist groups, including For the Many, Citizen Action, the Mid-Hudson Valley chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America, and the statewide coalition Housing Justice for All. The reduction applied to rental properties that fall under the ETPA, a rent stabilization law that dictates rent increases for certain city buildings. Kingston became the first city north of the New York City suburbs to adopt the law earlier this year. So yeah, they got a whole bunch of these socialist organizations. These organizations only have one thing that they want, right? They want the government to be able to take over housing and then set the price. That's what they really want. They don't want private property owners at all. Okay, they think that private ownership of anything is evil. They literally are socialists. They say right there in their title that they are socialists, right? But they don't seem to realize that, hey, go look at the public housing around New York City and then tell me that is the kind of quality housing that you want to live in. Those places are dumps. Okay? They're in horrible shape, and New York City Housing Authority is constantly voted as one of the worst landlords in the city. Okay? But so why would you want to socialize housing? No. Okay? I get frustrated when I read this stuff, because they had all these tenant groups, right? Many of them probably not even from the city, who don't own property in the city, don't live in the city, etc., right? Coming and pushing this socialist BS there, and then you know what happens? It will destroy the landlords in that city. It will destroy their businesses and make it impossible for them to make any money. And, what you'll see development going away. You'll see, rental properties just falling into disrepair. You'll see all of the negative effects. But they don't seem to realize that. They don't understand the way that economics works. They don't understand what supply and demand means. They think that the government can set prices. Well, you know what that tells me? They have zero knowledge whatsoever. Okay? They're just ignorant. On Friday, a local housing activist group, For the Many, issued a statement condemning Gandon's decision. This reduction was carefully deliberated by the Kingston Rent Guidelines Board after hearing data about Kingston's rising rents, as well as testimony from over 70 tenants and their supporters, For the Many said in a statement. Tenants described their outrageous rent hikes, some as high as 70%, arbitrary fees, and deteriorating apartment conditions. The vast majority called for a rent reduction. For comparison, only 6 landlords testified in opposition. Well, that's because there are way more tenants than there are landlords out there, okay? One landlord who owns a 100-unit building, well, you could have 100 tenants go in there and then protest, and then one landlord, well, this isn't right, we shouldn't be putting this in place, right? And you're like, but they get drowned out by the screams of 100 people who all want cheap rent. Okay, now in terms of deteriorating conditions, why do they think that a rent reduction would actually make the conditions in their buildings better? Okay, if the landlord doesn't have enough money to do repairs and maintenance based on the rents that are already in place, why do you think a rent reduction will make things better? And I've mentioned before why a landlord would have to raise their rents by 70%. Okay, some people are like, oh, it's not fair that my rent got raised by 70%. Well, you're thinking in terms of, when most people, when you hear the situation, you think in terms of, well, the person's rent was already at market rate, and then they rose it by 70%. So if the market rate is $1,000, and then they rose it by 70%, now all of a sudden the rent's $1,700. But that is not the case when you see large rent increases like this, right? Instead, you'll see an apartment or a house or a rental that is very far below the market rate, right? And when they raise it by 70%, it's bringing it up to the regular market rate for that unit. So imagine the market rate is $1,000, right? And the landlord is only charging $500 rent. Okay, so when they increase the rent by 70%, right? They're only bringing the rent up to $850. So guess what? It's still $150 below the market rate, but it was a 70% increase from where it was before, which was far, far below the market rate. See, these people, they don't understand these kind of economics, right? And yeah, that is tough for the tenant, but if the landlord has kept the rents super low for a long period of time, and then now they find that they are no longer able to keep up, or if you're a new owner of the building and you bought that building and you're just trying to do repairs, bring the property up to the current standard and the current rental rates, right? Then these sort of things happen, and it's one of those things. Okay, you cannot live forever in cheap rental housing expecting someone else to subsidize your living, unless you want literally the government to pay for your housing. So oh man, this is a frustrating story because it tells me that one, the people who run this rent guidelines board, they're extremely biased. The people who are in the city, like the government officials, when they passed this rent control, right, they obviously did not understand the economics behind rent control. They didn't do any research, or they think, well, this time it's different for us. It's different for us. You always hear this, when they talk about rent control, right? Well, we're going to put it in place and it's going to be different this time. Yet it always ends the same way. So yeah, good that the landlords got a temporary halt on this ridiculous law, but man, they still have a fight ahead of them.